Hey undergrad folks! Today we're going to be talking about Lynn Nottage and her celebrated play Ruined, which details the plight of women in the civil war-torn Democratic Republic of the Congo. Nottage, though not the most prolific playwright of our time, is certainly one of the most interesting and individual. She is an artist writing big-hearted yet political stories with both scope and empathy. Today we'll be going over a little bit of Nottage's life, how she created and developed the story of Ruined, and the themes and the critical reception of the play itself. A little bit of background on Lynn Nottage. She was born in 1964 in Brooklyn, New York, to Ruby and Wallace Nottage, a school teacher and a child psychologist, respectively. She grew up in a house full of laughter, and specifically in a house full of Black women, whose stories inspired her to tell her own. After graduating from Brown University in 1986, she went directly to Yale, where she received her MFA in playwriting in 1989. Before pursuing a full-time career as a professional playwright, she worked as a press officer for Amnesty International for 4 years and became intimately acquainted with the history and politics of various nations throughout the globe, and specifically became interested in the socio-political life of the continent of Africa. Nottage won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 2009 for Ruined, and again in 2017 for Sweat, the story of the deindustrialization and the ramifications thereof in a small town in Pennsylvania. She is the first woman of any race to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama twice since it was established in 1917. Nottage is also the second playwright of color, after August Wilson, to have won the prize twice. In a 2007 interview for the MacArthur Genius Grant, she described herself as, quote, a storyteller in the traditional sense. That means I tell my stories in front of an audience. I'm interested in telling stories of women from the African diaspora that are irreverent, that are humorous, that are joyful, end quote. We certainly see this in one of her most famous plays, Intimate Apparel, which tells the story of Esther, a Black seamstress in 1905 New York, sewing the titular intimate apparel to women from all walks of life, all the while dreaming of finding a husband and saving enough money to open a beauty parlor, where Black women will be treated as wonderfully as the white women she sews for. We also see this desire to tell the heretofore untold and unheard stories of Black women in her 2009 drama, Ruined. It's useful to take a brief look at what other U.S. playwrights were writing around the same time that Ruined emerged. So, Ruined premiered during the same months that Barack Obama became president of the United States. During this time, when George W. Bush was the outgoing president, the United States saw a surge of Iraq-themed plays and anti-war dramas, both fictional and documentary, a majority of which were written by women. Americans' views on their own recent history and the Iraq War were so darkly conflicted and deeply complicated, so that space had opened up to allow for direct comments and painful examinations of real-life events. Maybe not in hugely commercial venues, but at least in relevant theaters throughout the country. One of the plays that emerged during this time was Chiara Allegria Hudesa's Eliot, A Soldier's Fugue, which later became part of a trilogy including plays like Water by the Spoonful and Happy a Song Plays Last. Her first, Eliot, A Soldier's Fugue, examines the legacy of war through 3 generations of a Puerto Rican family, focusing on a 19-year-old Marine just back from Iraq. Another play written during this time was Sarah Ruhl's Passion Play, which was a take on the Passion of the Christ, in which the character of Pontius Pilate is a Vietnam War veteran who lives with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Another play is Ellen McLaughlin's Ajax in Iraq, a contemporary twist on Ajax by Sophocles. She references the real-life experiences of veterans in the 2 world wars and Vietnam, with the Greek goddess Athena narrating 2 stories about military suicide, betrayal, and sexual assault. The fourth play I'm going to talk about here is Prophecy by Karen Malpeed, which attempts to dramatize how young soldiers come home traumatized, guilt-ridden, and afraid through the story of a failed actress who was once active in the anti-Vietnam War movement and is now confronted by an acting student whose traumatic experience in the Iraq War triggers awful memories from the recent past. So this whole new crop of anti-Iraq war plays, all coming from American writers, weren't simply trying to inform the general public of the realities of war. Rather, they tried to explore, question, and assess a whole range of complex truths. They shared stories of the disenfranchised, the ill-informed, and the politically and physically weak. These plays gave audiences room to experience current events emotionally and to reflect intellectually. So Lynn Nottage, following this tradition of pushing back against the war in Iraq, originally set out to write an adaptation of Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children, set in the Congo. She imagined transporting the action from the 30 Years' War in 17th century Europe to 21st century Africa. We can see some surface similarities at a first glance. Similar to Mother Courage, Nottage's protagonist, Mama Noddy, profits by taking no sides in the war but her own. Mama Noddy's affection for her girls never stands in the way of business, yet her actions do not mirror Brecht's story of a crafty woman who loses everything in her life. Going further into the structure of these plays, their differences are further highlighted. Brecht wrote a socialist epic about a war profiteer where goodness and virtues are never rewarded. Nottage, on the other hand, wrote a hard-hitting humanist expose about the brutalization and weaponization of women's bodies during the decades-long armed conflicts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In order to begin her work on what was supposed to be her Brecht adaptation, she traveled to East Africa, something that she'd been longing to do since she was a child. She traveled with director Kate Horinsky, whom she had previously worked with on Intimate Apparel. The two women set out specifically to collect the stories of Congolese women. Nottage knew their stories were not being told and was interested in portraying the stories of these women who were constantly caught in the middle of armed conflicts and to understand who they were beyond their victimhood. She used a Guggenheim grant to travel around and interview female refugees fleeing armed conflicts in Uganda, Sudan, Congo, and Somalia, all of whom were victims of war, rape, and torture at the hands of armed forces. What Nottage was shocked to discover was how willing these women were to tell their stories, and in listening to them, she discovered what her play would really be about. In an interview, Nottage described how she truly discovered her story. Specifically, she talks about an interview with a woman named Salima, who you might recognize as the namesake for one of the girls in the play. Now, bear with me. This is a long quote, but it's worth hearing. So Nottage said, quote, "I remember the strong visceral response I had to the very first Congolese woman who shared her story. Her name was Salima, and she related her story in such graphic detail that I remember wanting to cry out for her to stop. But I knew that she had a need to be heard. She'd walked miles from her refugee camp to share her story with a willing listener. Salima described being dragged from her home, arrested, and wrongfully imprisoned by men seeking to arrest her husband. In prison, she was beaten and raped by 5 soldiers. She finally bribed her way out of prison, only to discover that her husband and 2 of her 4 children were abducted. At the time of the interview, she still had not learned the whereabouts of her husband and 2 children. I found my play ruined in the painful narratives of Salima and the other Congolese women, in their gentle cadences and the monumental space between their gasps and sighs. I also found my play in the way they occasionally access their smiles, as if glimpsing beyond their wounds into the future." End quote. In this particular quote, we can actually pinpoint the myriad ways in which Nottage was diverging from her contemporary fellows' examinations of war. So while the other anti-Iraq plays of this time tended to vent feelings of anger and helplessness in the U.S., Ruined actually dared to take up the cause of the voiceless from outside U.S. boundaries. Also, unlike other recent U.S. plays about conflict zones, Ruined doesn't depend on American characters as narrators. Her script trusts the audience to become familiar with the surroundings and circumstances on their own. Thirdly, while sexual violence in war-torn countries may be the kind of thing most people have read about in the New York Times or watched a CNN report about, it's something that's casually accepted as a harsh reality of the world. This play, however, doesn't let the viewer or the reader off the hook. It's fundamentally a play about gender inequality that goes above and beyond the Western issues of equal pay and glass ceilings. It's about the violation of African women's bodies, an occurrence so common and so entrenched in our public consciousness that it's considered old news, even while it's happening. So finally, Nottage's writing is special in that it dares to have moments of humor and glimpses of hope. Interestingly, and counter to her original intentions, Nottage seems to move as far from Brechtian strategies as possible, bringing audiences emotionally closer to the realities of a region where women have been violated and mutilated with sticks and bayonets by soldiers, where families have driven rape victims from their communities, where sexual torture has resulted in sterility or infection or death. At the same time, Ruined sustains, with as much depth and humor as Nottage could muster, the aspects of dignity, integrity, sensuality, simplicity, and endurance that she found during her 2 trips to refugee camps in Africa in 2004 and 2006. She also mixes danger with continued signs of vibrancy. There's live music and sometimes dancing, signs that life goes on no matter how morbid the past or present could be. On a similar note, it's important to mention that while this play is fundamentally about gender inequality, it does not demonize all the men in the play. She expresses that, yes, violence will perhaps continue, but it doesn't mean that there are no Congolese men like Christian, who we see in the play as loving, nurturing, and supportive. This message of hope and vitality may be easy to accept in retrospect and in theory, but the most persistent criticism of Ruin during its initial run was that Mama Nadi was offered the chance for romantic love in the climax, and people found that too upbeat for a play about war, rape, and survival. For a closing thought, I'll leave you with Nottage's response to such criticism. She said, quote, "My response? They have never been to Africa. They have never spent time with these women to understand that you can be brutalized and still find a way to heal. It was very important to me to be optimistic about that and to still tell the truth." End quote. All right, guys, enjoy your class on Ruined and Lynn Nottage.